Hey, folks, welcome back to the Becoming series, exploring the deep truths and the principles that will enable you become everything you were created to be and do. Now, interestingly enough, there's a particular concept that when we're talking about something like becoming, um, tends to be discounted a lot, which is unfortunate, really, right? Because it is really a key concept. It's a very critical concept. And what is that concept? It is the concept of strategy, right? um now normally when we think strategy, we usually think it in the context of business, or the military, because we're talking about business strategies or military strategies. You call a war general who was a great strategist because he thought about the things that he needed to do in battle, etc. Or we're talking about business strategies where company A wants to be able to make a name for itself in the market, so it's implementing strategies that would enable it to get there. So those are fine, but that concept is also something that can be um, tailored for individual purposes, because really at the at the root of all achievement is this concept, right? And what do I mean by that? Anything that you've ever observed, any great achievements that you've ever observed that was done by anybody, was actually done with a strategy in mind, right? Now the problem is that we tend to focus on the other aspects and not pay sufficient attention to this one, right? So we're talking about vision, for instance, which is great because that is the starting point, or rather purpose is the starting point, because you must have an understanding of what the key assignment of your life is, right? And of course, as I said before, the difference between purpose and vision is, purpose is the reason, that's the objective, that's the goal, that's the intention. When you can see it in your mind's eye, that is the vision, right? So vision flows from purpose. um but a lot of things tend to stop at that level and don't get executed for whatever reason, maybe due to, I don't know, maybe disbelief or laziness, or circumstances that might come your way that maybe tend to discourage you, right? But like I said, we don't pay sufficient attention to this other concepts of strategy, because what strategy does is essentially to help you create a roadmap, right, for the actualization of the vision. So we just talked about forecasting, and forecasting is actually a key component of strategy, right? Because if I were to summarize it, in a single word or a single question, I would say it's the how. So if you think in terms of single words, right, monosyllables, if you will. So purpose is the why. I call it the why question. Why are we doing this? Why am I here? Uh, why this business? Why this time? Why this people? Why this? Why? When you ask the question why, you're essentially asking the question of purpose, right? And like I said, when you answer that question and you can see it internally in your mind's eye, that's the vision. But strategy is asking a different question altogether. It is asking how. Is asking how. And at the point of how, you're getting into real practical stuff. Vision tends to be, up in the air, or, you know, very conceptual, in terms of what we're seeing in our mind's eye, etc. But strategy, you know, takes it down to the nitty gritty. We're talking practical steps, right? Um, like I said, at the root of every great achievement, there has been a strategy, and it calls to mind one of my favorite characters in the Bible was essentially King David. I'm sure we all know the story. David was a young guy who was catapulted to the throne, of Israel, as possibly the greatest king, the greatest earthly king that Israel ever had. But most of us tend to forget, or maybe we don't pay sufficient attention to the fact that yes, David was anointed to be king, right? And he was essentially anointed when he was a teenager, like 16, 17 years old. But he did not become king until he was 30, right? So that's a gap of about 12, about 13, 14 years. Now, what was he doing in that time? You also possibly remember that during those times he was going through a period of testing because his mentor, quote unquote, King Saul, was somebody who was jealous of him and who was really against him. He was the real enemy. Most of us tend to look at the David and Goliath story, but we're forgetting the David and Saul story, which was actually a much deeper um, trial process for David, right? So David had to pass through that phase, and as he was going through that phase, he was developing. He was developing himself. But that's not really where I'm going. Where I'm going is David was anointed to be king, right? So if you were to ask David what his purpose was, that would be it. I'm anointed to be the king of Israel. Now, he didn't stop at that point to say, okay, I'm anointed to be king of Israel. So by some miraculous circumstance, I'll just find myself on the throne. He actually had to develop a strategy. And if you look through the scriptures, you'd see the sort of things that he was doing, right? He knew that one of the key things that was essential um, to becoming a king in that world in that time was military victory, right? And David was somebody who was totally successful in that. As a matter of fact, the Bible records that he never lost a battle, right? So he knew that one of the keys to attaining that vision or that purpose was to have military victory um, over the enemies of Israel, the Philistines, the Amalekites, etc. Another key thing that also tends to be discounted, if you're looking at the story of David, for instance, is the way that he was able to um, look at circumstances. And essentially, what he was doing was play chess. Now, this is something because people who play chess necessarily have developed that skill of strategy because they're not just looking at the set piece or the immediate game. They're also thinking long term, which is what strategy is. You have to think long term. You're not just thinking 1 month ahead or 3 months ahead. 3 months ahead. You're thinking long term, right? And when you're thinking long term, sometimes it means that your short term battles you might have to give up. You might have to accommodate a temporary defeat in order to ensure that the long term victory is attained, right? So what does David do? He sees that when Saul dies, the throne essentially is supposed to be his, but he knows that Saul still has family, right? He has a daughter, he has grandchildren, each of whom have rights to the throne, because you're talking the process of progenitor, right? If I'm a king, it means that when I leave, either my son or one of my near relatives is supposed to ascend the throne. David wasn't a relative of Saul, he was from a different tribe altogether. So he knows that for him to ascend to the throne, he has to eliminate all the other contenders. So for instance, there's a question that he asked one of his servants. He said, is there anybody else left in the house of Saul whom I can show kindness to? Now, a lot of people read that verse and they're thinking, oh, David was such a nice guy, and all that. But no, David was actually thinking strategically because he knew that if there was anybody else left in the house of Saul, it meant that that person would have a legitimate claim to the throne. So you had to ensure that all those other people who could legitimately lay claim to the throne have to be dealt with. Not necessarily that he would have to kill them, but he had to find a way to ensure that their power was nullified. And eventually that's what he did, and that is how he became king at the age of 30. So it's one thing to have a vision, it's one thing to have the purpose, what your purpose is and all that, but it's quite another to develop a sound strategy. And like I said, strategy is long term, becoming is long term, right? So it also means that thinking strategically means um, you must take a long term view. Sometimes it means that you might have to go through a few corners that don't, in the short term, don't seem as if they are playing out, right? But that long term is eventually it's going to make you end up at the place where you need to be at, right? So strategy is a very key concept, and let's all try to be a little bit more strategic in our thinking.